Mike Clouden.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. As the voice of God just showed you, I'm Mike Clouden, CEO of the Milken Institute, and it really is my pleasure to welcome you to this year's London Summit. We have a great program, as you all know, because I'm sure you have all looked at it, and we've got a very full day ahead of us, and we're going to get started right away. Before we get started, though, I want to just do a few thank yous. First, I'd like to thank Heron International for their hospitality over the past several years and for their assistance with this summit. They have generously allowed us to stay here. We want to thank Salesforce.com for letting us use this particular space. The tower has been the home of our London Summit since the first one in 2011. And this is our last year here because this is an office building and the space is leased. And these floors, in fact, are leased by Salesforce. They'll be moving in, start working on it shortly, but they were kind enough to let us use it one more time. And all of the walls you see and everything on these floors, these are all things we build for the summit. This is all just bare space that'll be built out as soon as we move out. So this is our last year, and we're delighted to be here one more time. Now, the work of the Milken Institute throughout the year and across the world is not possible without the support of our strategic partners. And we'd like to thank all of our strategic partners whose names you see on this slide for their year-round support. And as far as this conference, this summit is concerned, I want to give thanks to the summit sponsors who sponsored this particular event. Their names are here. And I'd just like to ask all of you to join me in giving thanks to all of them. Now, your experience today is going to be even richer and your time more productive if you download and use our Milken Institute Summit app. The information about that is up on the bridge. And the Wi-Fi, in case you haven't found it yet here, is available throughout the conference. It's accessible via the network, London Summit. No password necessary, so you can log on to Wi-Fi that way. Now, normally I like to talk about the Milken Institute, but I think we ought to get started. At lunch today, you're going to have a chance to, in addition to having a fine meal, have a chance to learn more about what we do. So let's move to our opening plenary. And the plenary, as you know, is Global Overview, Geoeconomics versus Geopolitics. And we have a very distinguished panel whose names and bios are in the program and very accessible on the app if you use that. But I would like to specifically introduce our moderator, Francine Lacroix. Francine is anchor and editor-at-large of Bloomberg Television. She hosts the weekday programs On the Move and The Pulse, which cover international business, economics, and market-moving stories. She also hosts Eye to Eye, in which she conducts conversations with CEOs, entrepreneurs, and policymakers inside the London Eye. That seems very appropriate for this session, and we will, in just a little more time than it takes the eye to go around the world. And by the time we're through, Francine, in the next 15 minutes or so, I am sure we are going to know everything there is to know about the world today. So I turn it to you, Francine.
Thank you so much. We have to reshape the world in 55 minutes, no mean feat. So thank you so much, first of all, to my panelists for coming here today, because I know it's going to be a great conversation. I'd like to introduce all of them. First of all, Marissa Drew. She runs the European Investment Banking Division for Credit Suisse. Mo Ibrahim, chairman of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation. We have Nirmala Sitharaman, Minister of State for Commerce and Industry and Minister of State for Finance and Corporate Affairs from India. We have Anne Richards, Global Chief Investment Officer of Aberdeen Asset Management, and Alexander Yakovenko, the Russian ambassador to the United Kingdom. So it's going to be a very diverse and comprehensive, of course, discussion that we're going to start off. Minister, let me start off with you, because we were talking, of course, about what we were going to discuss. And it seems that in the last year, so much has happened around the world, but also in India, of course. And the perspective from investors is one, I guess, of nervousness, jitters. What has changed in your eyes fundamentally over the last year?
Lots have changed. The new government has been elected with a good majority. It is not a coalition government. It is a government which has come out very clearly saying we need to unshackle the Indian economy. It's a government which has come out very clearly saying we are in favor of open economic policies, transparent decision making, a corruption-free India, and therefore a lot of emphasis to be given on manufacturing and investment. Manufacturing and investment will be our priority, and for that, on that, we have got the mandate of the people of India, and therefore we are here to deliver on those goals. That's what has changed in India today.
Difficult and exciting times. Marissa, I want to come to you because when you see the world, we're always in a flux, and every year we seem to say, oh, but next year will be better. Next year, we'll have this solved. And actually, what have we achieved in the last 12 months?
Well, I think you had asked me before the panel started, what do I worry about? And I think when I wake up every day, probably the thing I worry about most is geopolitical tensions and their effect not only on our personal safety and on world economics, but also on investors' psyche. So being in the financial services industry, the manifestation of people's fears was very evident in mid-October of this year, where everything was going along swimmingly, and all of a sudden the investor psyche changed on a dime. And we had people run from the emerging markets. We had people run from cyclical equities. We had people run from high-yielding credit. And everybody was piling their money into safe assets as, I think, a manifestation of their fears of what's going on the world stage. So I think that's one area that I certainly worry about. So I think the new norm is clearly going to be a lot more volatility going forward. And the second thing I would point to, which again, is very near and dear to my heart in financial services, is the lack of harmonization in regulatory policy, particularly around financial services, whether it be the fact that it creates unlevel playing fields across the world, whether it requires financial services institutions like big banks to be moving their ships, very large ships, in different directions based on which politician is putting in place a new regulatory regime. It creates asset bubbles, and it creates unusual unintended consequences. I think we're all very worried in financial services about the advent of shadow banking, an unregulated sector. Is that going to be our next bubble? Things of that ilk. So those are the things that I'm spending a lot of time, I think, thinking about as I wake up every morning.
And to Marissa's point, it seems that there is a lot of volatility on the markets. This is something just that we have to get used to, or how do you address that? As an investor, are you afraid of the markets moving too quickly, not really based on anything?
So we're starting this in quite a negative tone already, actually, and I think it's human nature to find more things to worry about sometimes than it is to find things to be positive about, and I think there are things to be positive about out there. So I'm just going to park that as a thought. In terms of volatility, as an investor, you can get sucked into worrying about volatility when you don't need to. Short-term volatility doesn't tell you very much about risk at all. It is simply a measure of how the demand and supply short-term is moving. And I think that's important to bear in mind. Risk is something much deeper than volatility, and the two should not be overly connected. Having said that, I think psyche, as has been said, has changed. And I think one of the things that has changed is that the risk of something bad happening, there has been a shift in it's not that there are more bad possible outcomes out there, it's this feeling that the possibility that they might come to fruition has arisen. And part of that, perhaps most of that, has come actually from here in Europe. I think the shift in understanding of what is going on in Europe has caused concerns. And I'm not just talking about geopolitics, I'm talking about actually the political mechanisms which sit domestically within Europe. So I think that is one thing that's changed. I think a second thing that's changed over the last year has been our view on inflation, or perhaps our view on the likelihood of deflation. If you had said 5 years ago that after the degree of monetary easing and the degree of quantitative easing that we've had, that we would not today have an inflation problem, most people would have been surprised. And yet we're still looking at inflation numbers which are constantly coming in below expectations. I think the realization of the implications of that are quite important, and we might come back to that in the context of some other things. And I think the third thing that has changed psychologically is that there has been a belief that monetary policy would do all the heavy lifting. And again, particularly here in Europe, a growing realization that actually Mr. Draghi can't do it all by himself. Monetary policy can only go so far. And if the transmission mechanisms from loose monetary policy through to the real economy aren't coming through, then that is not in itself enough to lift an economy. And we're seeing that in Europe. And I think it's an interesting contrast with something like India, for example, where you've got a much better alignment of monetary policy and government policy in terms of understanding what needs to be done.
Dr. Ibrahim, when we talk about quantitative easing and the European Central Bank, it seems that they are doing a lot, maybe too much, but it seems that the markets, and this is year after year, just can't cope with that QE, which is why we still have it and it's not going anywhere.
Yes, we are all speculating what's going to happen when quantitative easing ends or likely to end. Obviously, the emerging markets are worried, and my banker's friend here may be better than me to talk about this. But let me just respond to my colleague. I worry a lot. How I cannot worry about Europe, which facing a major problems on the issue of freedom of movement of people, or the issue of fiscal control. Where is it? I mean, the issue of the rise of extremist forces in Europe, we worry about that. How can't we worry when we see suddenly the Cold War is back again, and we have a standoff, and we start to hear the same language we used to 30 years ago. When we see China involved in disputes with almost every neighbor, how can't we worry about that? When we see the so-called ungovernable spaces in the Middle East and elsewhere increasing day after day, how can't I worry about Ebola? And how come a problem started in a very remote village, almost inaccessible village in Guinea, suddenly is a problem for everybody, whether it's in Dallas or New York or Madrid or whatever. We have some challenges really, and I worry. How can't I worry about this? Sorry, just divert a little bit.
Ambassador, do you worry?
Yeah, to a certain extent, I fully agree. Because, you know, on one hand, we have the end of the Cold War. It's quite clear that there will be no war and no expectation of the big war. It's over. And this is a very positive part. But on the other hand, you know, we have to do a lot of things on the strategic stability. Because, you know, anti-ballistic missile systems, you know, and the plans of the United States, you know, to build this in Europe, it's makes a concern. But we believe that, you know, we'll manage that somehow. But worries, yes, I fully agree, because, you know, first of all, there are a lot of regional conflicts, and of course, the instability that we see in the Middle East, and still, you know, in Afghanistan. Then in some other places, I'm talking about Africa, you know, makes us really great concern. This is first. Second, I would like to say that the terrorism and the organized crime and the drugs, that's another challenge. For example, you know, last 10 years, you know, Afghanistan started producing 10 times more heroin than it did before. I mean, that's a huge numbers. What does it mean? That means that they are getting money which will be used for the financing of the extremism and terrorism. So that's another worry. There are certain things that are of global nature, but what I want to say is that my biggest worry is that we are not united enough in front of these threats. Because, you know, I remember, you know, I was dealing with the UN Security Council issues, and I would like to say that every time we had a consensus in the Security Council, we were successful. And we couldn't reach the consensus on certain things, like it was, let's take Iraq, Libya, and there was a full failure of the policy there. And we see what's happening in Libya. That's why, we have to find some kind of a unity at the Security Council, and that means that will be globally. From that point of view, we could manage a lot of risks. If we'll stay apart, this will be a huge problem for all of us. And the basis for that is the trust. As you rightly said, we're missing trust today. And with all this rhetorics of the Cold War, which is so familiar to us, it's not a Cold War, but this is some kind of a reflectory, feelings. That's why for us, it's the key question is the trust and the unity in the world. The closer we'll come to that, the better it will be.
Ambassador, of course, Russia has been more than in the headlines over the last 7 months. What's the question you get the most asked here in the UK?
Well, I would like to say that probably the latest, this is the Ukraine, is definitely. Because, there are some different presentation of that subject in the Western press, and West, I mean US and EU. All the rest of the world is a little bit different. And of course, the consequences of this crisis. Because today, from my point of view, this is the question that I get from the MPs, British MPs. They don't know what to do with the Ukraine today. Because, the key question for the Ukraine now is to have legitimate, let's say, government. And we know that there were results in the parliament, and we acknowledge these results. But the government of Ukraine should do something, to launch the dialogue among all the parts of Ukraine. This is a serious issue. And the second one is, and this is, I think, could be very interesting for the others, what to do with the economy. Because the economy is dropping. I mean, its official figure is 10%, but it's much higher, the drop of the economy. So for us, this is the question, how are we going to do this together? Because I remember the Yanukovych, when he was the president, he said, we need a transitional period. And the cost of this transitional period, because he expected the failure of the economy of Ukraine, is $30 billion a year, $30 billion a year. So that's basically what we're facing today in Ukraine, I mean the world community. So this is the most frequently asked question, and we can do something together.
Ambassador, just very quickly, and then I want to move on to other parts of the world, but to the question, what to do with Russia, what do you answer?
What
to do with Russia?
To do with Russia?
Yeah.
To cooperate.
Minister, we talk a lot about the balance of powers, and actually I'd like to call number 26 in terms of a slide, because it really shows that India and China will dominate the world economy, not so far, in 2030. And yet we talk a lot about QE, we talk a lot about Europe. Do you feel that, once again, it's the old economy that almost hijacks a lot of the headlines?
Well, I would put it this way. The emerging economies such as India, and I purposely say such as India, as differently from China, don't get as much space as they deserve. And in that, speaking for India, naturally, but more importantly, speaking for India because it has a lot of shared value with the advanced economies, be it democracy, sustained democracy since we have become independent in 1947 from the British Empire. Other than that, nearly 65% of our population is youth population, working force. They are all empowered and they are looking for opportunities which the Indian government is committed to provide to them. So you're talking of democracy, you're talking of a certain demographic dividend which has got the biggest workforce in the world. They may be partly skilled, they may be fully skilled, they may be some not so very well skilled. Third, the biggest market lies out there in India. The market which has the purchasing power, and today is seen, if my statistics are right, 1 in every 7 human being in the world is an Indian, and he's everywhere. The purchasing power that this community has, this large Indian citizenry have, is something for every investor to look at. So with all these 3 virtues of democracy, demographic dividend, and also the market that exists there, India stands out as a best place, as the best place for investment. And therefore, for me, we don't get that space in any discussion or in media coverage that we deserve. And so, in a way, I'm putting your question back to you, saying, yes, we have this feeling that we need more attention, we need more understanding of India, rather than block us either to the right or to the left, saying this is a right-wing thought or that is extreme left-wing thought. We are evolving in India a certain economic framework which is going to be unique to us. It cannot be clubbed with the left ideologically driven framework of something is the center and anything to the right becomes right and you carry it forward to the extreme right. Ideologically, we don't, Indian economy does not fit into that framework. Nor are we trying to stand out saying we are very different. But in that we will, it's like a jigsaw into which we shall put in each one of our bits to make it consistent with what is the framework available elsewhere. But the fact is that we are in many ways, like the much talked about the WTO, we are into multilateral trade negotiations. We believe multilateralism is the way out for international trade, and we are consistent in saying that we want to be compliant with what has been agreed in WTO. But when it comes to the question of the huge Indian population to which we have an obligation to and a duty as a government to take care of, we will be concerned about public stock holding of food grains, and that's not being inconsistent at all. We want to be part of the trade facilitation, and we've taken a lot of measures for it. So we want the WTO and the international community therefore to understand that there is a duty for every government in its own context. And in fact, if I'm not going to sound cynical, I know the conversation has largely been on a negative tone, but I don't want to be cynical when I say I do not want the rest of the world also to come back to me to say, oh my God, you're starving millions, what are you doing about them? So obviously I need to attend to it. So that's where I find we don't get the space that we need to get, the kind of attention and understanding that we deserve. WTO is a concrete example of that.
Can I add one more little anecdote? So for those of you who are not aware, at forums like this, Mike Milken always has a quiz that he asks of all of the panelists. And last night we had a dinner with everyone who's going to be on a panel today, and he was asking questions about the various stock exchanges around the world. And I think only one table got the answer to the quiz right, which is which stock exchange has the largest number of listed companies in the world?
Yes.
India. India. Only one table got that right.
It's a very good anecdote. And Anne, you're invested quite a lot in emerging markets and in India. Are a lot of emerging markets misunderstood? We talk a lot about structural reform being needed in some countries. Are we trying to push too much of our models onto them? And fundamentally, some of them, do we need to be a little bit more lax?
Well, I think there's a couple of things in there to unpack. I mean, the first is that we have got the pie chart, I don't know which number it is, but just that shows the share of global economy. If you ask people what proportion of the global economy is in so-called emerging markets, it's more than 50%, which feels pretty emerged, actually, to me. So we do tend to look at the world through the wrong end of the telescope. So I completely endorse that. And we have been big investors in India for a very long time. We invest in China and the other emerging markets as well. But I think India has many, many advantages to it in terms of the rule of law, in terms of shareholder protection for minority shareholders. So while there are challenges within the economy, I think I would endorse the fact that we have a tendency not to look at the full richness of the picture within India and within the broader emerging markets. And we're not sufficiently discriminatory between all of them. And this idea of volatility goes up, sell emerging markets, volatility drops, buy emerging markets, ignores the tremendous changes in capital flows, for example, that there have been. We're not in the same situation we were in 97, 98. The capital requirements of different countries, their dependency on capital from, in quotes, the West varies enormously. And as investors, we need to be much more discriminatory between the different countries and between the different companies within those countries to understand what it is that we're buying. And we are overly simplistic in the way that we view the world. And I completely agree with that.
I couldn't agree more. I think one of the things that we were talking about as it specifically relates to India, but I think this holds true with all the emerging markets, back to my comment about what I worry about with regulatory policy in financial services, and this is well directed in terms of the policies that we operate under if we're going to do business with a client, the know your customer regime, which is exceptionally onerous to try to understand who you're dealing with. That works in a Western context, but if you are trying to get to a KYC type of environment for an emerging market in some place like India, I think that actually will starve access to liquidity. So I think that's just one small example of where you have these imbalances in the world that are regulatory driven, but that are going to be causing problems in terms of getting that precious capital to where it's needed.
When we talk about monetary policy, do we need to be much more global as well? Or is that impossible just by the nature of the exercise?
I wish I could say optimistically that we will come to harmonization, but I actually think some regulatory policy is politically driven. And anytime that happens, unfortunately, the manifestation of that is going to be differential policy, and that is exactly what we're seeing today. When I think about a firm like Credit Suisse, we have 3 regulators, FINMA in Switzerland, the primary regulators, the PRA here in the UK, and the Fed in the US. And even in the US, different banks are operating under different regulators. And even their policies are causing us to respond to different requirements. So if you think about managing a large organization with just the Western context, it's a challenge.
Right. There's just something which I'd like to highlight. Again, going back to this pie chart, which is in front of us, the rise from 7 to 11%, as is projected here, between 12 to 30, is not going to be possible unless, as the lady participant here told us very clearly, in India, the regulatory framework is very, very strong. And even as we were talking about, monetary policy alone cannot carry the economy's baggage, is absolutely right. And in India, the monetary policy and the fiscal policy work in perfect tandem with each other. And the government, particularly the new government, understands the burden that fiscal policies can bring on if it is not very well managed. And in governance, the record of this Prime Minister, even as he was a Chief Minister of a particular province, Gujarat, is very clear that he has remained well within the firm framework of both monetary and fiscal policy within the state. And as a party, the Bharatiya Janata Party's credibility in managing the economy, and therefore today, now that we are in the central government, credibility in managing economy comes in only when you're able to consistently hold both the fiscal and the monetary balance when you're managing the economy. And that's been the unique selling point for the Bharatiya Janata Party and for Mr. Modi, who's now the Prime Minister. And this kind of a projection couldn't be possible if you did not have that kind of hold on both the sides of the the road, as it were, unless you were able to see what kind of threats or challenges that come up from either the monetary side or the fiscal side. And towards that end, I would just like to also highlight a particular distinction that prevails in India, and which, because we are likely to take care of it, I can see this being absolutely a consistent projection. There is a large section in India, and I would go on to explain it through 2 or 3 more anecdotes, but I wouldn't do that for the constraint that the time has on us. But there are very many micro businesses which actually keep the wheels moving and which are very vibrant and buoyant, and it is that which is going to push our economy forward. And therefore, there is a lot of emphasis on small and medium enterprises in India under our government now. And for that, there is a great big financial inclusion program that we've started, just because these small and microeconomic units do not even benefit from financial assistance from financial institutions. And in fact, even without defying anything that the Basel norms would bring on banking and banking related matters, we find that they have not been approached by any financial institution till now. And the program that was launched by us only on 15th of August happens to be our Independence Day, till today has already accessed nearly 7 crore people. And that all of them who have been covered by bank accounts, credits, easy credits, without affecting the banking structure, has made a big difference for small and medium entrepreneurs. And that sector is a very self-employed, own account owners, as you may call them. They are the own account owners who move the economy forward at a very small micro level, but volume which they cover is distinctly large. And that's where I think if you're looking at a larger Basel-based formula for banking, you may not see them in the picture at all. But we as a government reach out to them because they are the ones who are at the lower end of the value chain but do contribute to exports. And that's where I think the policies that our government is taking may not be visible in the radar which covers a certain level but not below it. I would want that kind of an attention and study be done on India that this sector, which is a bulk sector, will contribute to economy which will otherwise be missed out on.
Can I just comment on that? Just a slight segue from that is that I guess one of the things we should all be optimistic about is the fact that the capital markets are incredibly efficient. So our small variation on the theme is post-crisis, and with the Basel III regime, it is punitive to lend to below investment grade companies. So you've seen a shrinking of bank lending, particularly to the peripheral economy. So if you look in every jurisdiction, who was supporting the SME universe, it was largely local banks. So in Spain, the Cajas, in Germany it was the Landesbanks and so forth. And with the shrinking of their ability to lend to the SME sector, which is the engine to fuel the economy, to your point, what has happened is the capital markets have stepped in to fill the gap. And so we've seen an absolute explosion, say, in the bond market as an example, or institutional loan market in Europe, which is now beginning to shift to the point where we're going to look pretty soon, probably a whole lot like the US, which is 80% capital markets, maybe 20% bank debt. So I do think, in the grand scheme of things, capital will find a home, over time, and there are certainly some good case studies around that.
Banks have been somewhat distracted with the stress test, so maybe from today, they can now focus back on lending.
Well, I think
small and medium enterprises.
Lending in the grand sense pre-crisis, it's just a different world. So I think true balance sheet capital lending is a different place than it was before. But also on the stress test, I think, despite the headlines of 25 billion euro requirement, a lot of that's actually already been raised. Yeah. And if we think about how much has been raised in just a year's time for the banking sector, the actual amount to meet the thresholds is relatively limited. So
they can lend.
They can probably get there, and where they can lend, they will.
I just want to comment on an early remark where you complained about political interference and overregulation. Please wake up, because we live in a real world around us. It seems the failure of bankers to understand the amount of anger among the people is just incredible. Sure. You guys live in a bubble. You need to understand what's happening out in the streets there. And the age of light touch regulation is finished. It cannot come back again, because you almost broke us to bankruptcy as bankers. This is true. And then when you failed, you came to the taxpayers and said, oh, please put your hands in your pocket and save me. Now, is this capitalism? Capitalism, a company makes a profit, you keep your money. You make losses, you give it to me as a taxpayer. This is not capitalism. What is this? Clearly, let me finish. Please let me finish. Okay. You had a lot of time to speak. Okay. Let the average people speak now. So people are really pissed off with banks. Absolutely. And you pay yourself incredible salaries, incredible bonuses, and deliver failure. How many jobs were lost around? How much pain around? Because you choose to gamble. You want to gamble, you go to Las Vegas. You need to register under the Gaming Act. But
the culture has changed. Has it not?
That's what I'm saying. But she is complaining that political interference. I'm saying no. There is political interference. There has to be political interference, because politics should represent the will of the people, and people are not happy with what happened before. So you need to get used. You need to adjust your industry to the realities of new world. The world is changing a lot of around us at the moment. One important thing I think everybody also need to appreciate: corruption, taxation is going. is a big issue now. Companies taxation, multinational taxation is a big issue now. Tax havens are under real scrutiny now. Anonymous companies are going to end very soon now. So if any of you have an anonymous company, please sort it out before you get embarrassed. So we are moving into a new world. People need to understand that. Things are changing around us. And let us just forget about the past. It will not come back again. That's what I think.
May I respond, please?
Yes.
With respect. I've spent my entire life actually raising capital to fund growth companies to help spur the economy. So what I've done in my career, which I'm very proud of, is build whole industries by providing capital, the lifeblood capital companies. And that at its essence is what banks do. So I do not disagree. So you and I don't disagree at all. That regulation is a necessary evil.
So you're a good banker.
What my issue is when regulation is not harmonized, and then to be able to actually respond to regulation coming at moment, and taxation, all of it.
That's not to be harmonized.
That actually...
No more Irish double whammy and no more, because it's
but
a race
that
to the bottom.
cuts against, in my opinion, that cuts against our ability to do what we're supposed to be doing, which is providing capital to our companies and our economies.
We are in agreement.
So I don't think we're in the same place. But and I hope all bankers are not bad people.
Okay.
But so the culture, Mirza, the culture has changed. Is that fair to say in the last 3 years?
Absolutely. I think if you look at the who's at the top of banks today, look at the complexion of who's leading the banking sector, that in and of itself probably indicates how far things have changed. But I also think that we are not banks immune to the issues. There were excesses, obviously. There were huge, huge issues. But I think if you go back, as I say, why am I in this business? Because I want to be an agent of change. I want to bring us back to an industry that is respected for what it does and gets back to basics. I mean, that's what it's all about. So, and I think hopefully in a senior leadership position in my organization, I can start from the top down and infuse that sense of ownership in terms of what we do and accountability of what we do every day.
Minister?
Just to add, that little cameo dialogue there on tax and tax-related matters is a very important one. Even in India today, we are very keen on understanding how we can simplify tax structures so that there's no flight of capital from out of India. But even more importantly, I also took part in the G20 Ministers Conference, the Finance Ministers Conference, and I was glad to see the emphasis on tax-related information sharing, which has got to happen all over the world now. Economies cannot afford to have wealth invested or stacked which don't belong to them, which actually will have to be repatriated or be identified and red flag raised on them, because economies are being depleted for things which they should actually do something about. I agree. But it cannot be as if monies can lie elsewhere without being accounted for or without being recognized as wrong money being in wrong place. And therefore, I was glad that the G20 initiative on sharing of tax-related information between countries, otherwise the flight of capital, which actually needs to be taxed, wherever, country A, country B, it doesn't matter. There will always be this whole layer of money which will be floating around without being compliant on tax demands, be it in country A or be it in country B. We cannot afford as economies to lose out on this layer of capital which goes away like an amoeba. Wherever you're trying to catch it, it sort of goes away elsewhere. So I think this initiative will have to be given strength. Due legislative amendments in each of our countries will have to be done just so that right information with the right sources on right demand from sovereign nations will have to be shared.
And Ambassador, you were nodding your head because this is...
I wanted to echo, the work of the G20, because that's a really very serious initiative that will impact on all the tax transparency in the world. We're just at the beginning of this, let's say, big work, but I think in 1 or 2 years we'll have more transparency, and this will influence on all international business. It will...
Oh, your mic's gone.
Sorry. Just, I want to say that we just started doing this big work on this tax transparency on the G20 that was launched last year, and I think this will influence on the whole international business. it will increase the corporate transparency. And from our point of view, this will help to find with the tax, avoidance or something. So G20 took a lead on that, and we're supporting this quite strongly. But the implications will be really worldwide. And this is just one more reason to say that the G20 is still alive and is doing a good job.
You're still a member of the G20?
Yes. Okay,
good. No, I like that, because I don't think when you have difference with somebody, you kick them out of the room.
Yeah. This is the G7 who left G8.
No, but even
But speaking about, may I say just one figure? I was struck by the report of the IMF, which was published recently, and there were quite an interesting figure about the purchasing power parity. And this year, the 7 emerging countries, this is Brazil, India, Indonesia, China, Mexico, Russia, and Turkey, surpassed the G7 on its so-called PPP. So this is $37 trillion against $34 trillion. So this is a major shift now. So G7 has less purchasing power than the 7 emerging markets. And this will be quite an interesting shift for the 21st century, including the resources, the financial resources.
Yep.
Dr. Ibrahim, so we have a lot of ground still to cover, but let me just get back to the point. When you look at the world, you were saying that, of course, you're concerned about Ebola, and this is just something, I guess, that we have to resolve through vaccination, getting more help on the ground. But the other thing you mentioned is the fact that governments need to deal with disillusioned populations in Europe. How far can this go? Are we talking about possibly, even the UK leaving the EU? Is this something that is now possible? People talk about it, but no one really believes it.
Well, nobody believes that Scotland will leave UK. Then we all panicked in the last minute, and it was a real close call, actually. And what I find fascinating is that the English patriotic gentlemen, mainly gentlemen, usually men who do these things, who were lecturing the Scots about why we are better together, are the same guys who are now arguing that we should leave Europe. I mean, why are you extending? It is just crazy. It is so sad. It's so sad. It's the same phenomena. You see the same populist sort of politics playing on people's fears, and if things are not really fantastic, some difficulties, people playing on people's fear to peddle all these sort of things. Look at the rise of the right in France, in Italy, in Greece, and I really got worried, because if this phenomena continues, and if Greece is still in trouble, if we have 30–40% of the youth unemployed in Spain or in Greece or somewhere else, that is a serious problem. And that can produce political instability, a lurch to the right, and we end up where we thought we departed many years ago. So I think there's a real threat there. And unfortunately, many of our politicians all across Europe, they are driven really by the tabloid headlines, the short term. Does you want a nice headline next morning or a nice punchline, and playing on whatever is popular at the moment. And nobody's taking a long-term view of where we should be going and what should be doing. And that is extremely worrying. I don't see statesmanship in Europe. I really see short-termism, and people just want to be in office. I mean, it's just serious, I think. We have a problem.
Do you see statesmanship elsewhere in the world?
In Africa, I see some, actually. We have this prize for the African leaders who come democratically and do wonderful things and leave on time. And we managed to get 4 presidents in 7 years. I don't know how many leaders in Europe we get in the past 7 years who deserve this prize. I think we have better leaders than you guys in Europe. I'm sorry.
Angela Merkel's not doing too shabby.
You can learn a few things from us sometimes. I mean, look, you ask our American friends to learn from Nigeria how to control Ebola. Yeah? You can learn from Africa sometimes. And you know, we all learn from each other. You just have to be humble, a little bit humble.
That's a very fair point, and well said. And when you look at the world, of course, it's geopolitics, and I guess the disillusioned population. That's the most difficult to price in when you're dealing with the markets, because it can take you by surprise. It can take you by surprise. It's quite difficult to see, and that's why the elections in Italy and also Greece took everyone by surprise. How difficult and how much attention do you give to geopolitics?
The interesting thing about if you look at political votes in countries and you take anything more than about a 1 month view, I mean, India is a very interesting case in point. If you look at the run-up in the currency action and the stock market action ahead of the election and then subsequent to that, and the degrees of swings, we as investors, we tend to ignore a very large part of that because the sentiment swings around much more than very often the fundamentals of the companies and the businesses in which you're investing, whether you're investing in the stocks or the bonds or anything else. So I think at one level, we try and sail through that. I think the issue in Europe is a little more far-reaching than that, and you could make the case that the political risk in Europe is greater than in any emerging market country right now because of this lack of unity. Now, how do you create that unity? I think the challenge around the short-termism that we're seeing in European politics, we cannot dissociate that from this whole chain of events going back to the banking system and going back to monetary policy. Because I genuinely believe that it has been too easy for politicians in Europe to blame the banks for everything and not to undertake some very basic structural reforms. If you look at India, if you look at Japan, take Japan and the three arrows, you've seen the need for monetary policy, fiscal policy, and structural reform to be allied. And the debate is out, will that be successful or not? But at least there's a plan. I think the challenge when you look at Europe is there's been an attempt at monetary policy, probably about 3 years too late, always dragging its heels because we were fighting inflation until a year ago. On the fiscal side, the periphery has taken its medicine, but the core really has been very reluctant to do anything. And on the structural side, again, outside the periphery, there's been very, very little action. If you look at how easy it is to start a business, how easy it is to start a second business if your first business failed in France or failed in Italy, and you compare those numbers to the situation in the US, it's a dramatically different picture. We won't solve the unemployment problem unless we start investing in Europe, and you're not going to get investment starting in Europe until we get the banks transmitting their capital through. Now, perhaps now that we're through the stress tests, perhaps now that we've got that uncertainty out the way, we will start to see the banks use their balance sheet to do what they used to do, which is lending. But we need that to happen to sort the unemployment problem. And at the moment, I'm not seeing that circle there. So I think Europe is one of our biggest geopolitical risks.
One of the other risks that we identified was cybersecurity. Marissa?
Cybersecurity is something that I don't think all of us fully appreciate just how big a threat it is. We had a group of consultants come in to try to give us a sense of where we might be vulnerable as an organization. I think most of us think that our greatest level of risk lies around people hacking our internet systems. And what they described to us is actually a lot of infiltration, a lot of the risks surround anybody who's an outside contractor coming into your company. And if we think about the world of efficiency, where we're trying to do a whole host of outsourcing, we'd like to get things outside our organization. Well, anytime you enter into an arrangement on an outsourcing basis, that is a source of potential real risk for your organization. And it's these sorts of things that I don't think we have fully come to grips with. Number one, do we understand it? But number two, how do we handle it once we do understand it? And I don't know that there's great answers there. There's a lot of technology being developed to try to solve the problems. And Alexander, you and I had a bit of a conversation about that last night. But I think we're just on the cusp of really full appreciation and or having any tools to deal with it appropriately.
On the cybersecurity, I want to say that this question, it needs a global solution. Of course, it's very important, for the banks, for the companies, to find the right ways. But on a global basis, we're discussing this question in the United Nations for almost 5 years. And I would like to say that last year, the United States joined, the consensus on that. And that's a good sign because, I think we have a room, for developing some kind of a rules of the game, in a global sense. And this will be the next step. And I think this will be very helpful, for all of us just to join the efforts. But I fully agree that that's a huge problem. But coming back to the economy and the politics, I would like to say that today the economy is becoming more and more politicized. And the second thing I want to say that the governments are imposing some kind of a political decisions, on business more than it was in the 20th century. It's quite interesting. And the recent, events that we have around Ukraine and all these things, this is a good example. And the third thing is that the governments today more and more involved in the private business than before. And that's very interesting. It's quite a tendency, they are involving with the money, with the decisions, they're influencing, and that's a new tendency that we're facing today.
Yeah, I think it is a very serious problem, and it's very difficult to confront for a simple reason. We are unable to have any form of useful global cooperation to deal with a global problem. For a simple reason, the various states are really interested, again, on looking into each other's secrets and, the military establishments, the intelligence, etc. I don't imagine that the Russian army or the Chinese army is going to cooperate with the Pentagon I mean, everyone is developing their own weapons against the others, and when you discover a worm or, a way to penetrate someone, to keep it to yourself. And unfortunately, this is the most serious problem we have because there is no incentive at all to countries to cooperate. That's right. So this, again, is ungoverned space where terrible things are going to happen. And it's going to affect everybody.
Yeah, that's right. It's even in the internet now, there are a lot of discussions, how to run it. And still, there are no solutions for that because, one powerful country who runs the internet definitely doesn't like the idea of any management. But we'll come to that.
I think what is important is, other than the financial risks that we talk about, we cannot be risk averse when we're talking about newer ideas. We do not want to test newer ideas. We somehow feel very protected when we deal with the ways in which we handled our economies all this while. But solutions are coming from countries and economies which have not been so much in the core of the framework which was given to us between 1940 to today. I think when solutions are emerging from newer economies, which are very, very flexible solutions, which are adaptable in their own countries, I think older economies, which are represented by the United States and also the European countries, should not be risk averse when it comes to ideas which are coming from other countries. Pick up on the ideas which are coming up. The solutions are there. It is only when you think they are different solutions and they are not useful for me, I think you're missing out on an opportunity. Europe's revival now, I think, is ensured only when you're dealing with economies of the newer emerging countries, the newer emerging economies, India or China or any of these countries which have been named by the IMF. I think solutions which are emerging there will be the engines for growth and any kind of buoyancy in the economies of Europe and in the United States. I think you cannot afford to ignore those solutions, thinking that they are outside of your framework. I beseech the European countries not to be risk averse in trying out newer ideas. These are the economies which have got the market. These are the economies which are going to have the workforce, which will be youth and vibrant till about 2040. Even China's demographic dividend is going to peter out from 2015, which is next year. You are looking at economies which are otherwise performing very well, but only from the point of view of can I sell things to them, engage with them, understand their solutions. I think Europe's revival will emerge from that. But that is aside from talking about investment. I think solutions which have to be, as Mr. Mohammed rightly said, will have to be consistent with economies which want those solutions. You cannot have a solution which is drafted somewhere and given to them. And that's where the new government in India is very clearly trying to, I don't want to use the word struggle because we are happily engaging on that. We are happy to find solutions out of it. We are finding solutions which are consistent with our economic requirements as much as being compliant with the Western world's framework which is being given. And I think that's where the liberal approach to handling each of our issues will have to be country-specific without, of course, denying the multilateralism in most of our things.
And I want to finish, we just have a couple of minutes left. If we finish on a positive note, since we started a quite negative conversation, not only are we creating more wealth, Mirza, but there's a lot of hope in technology and innovation.
I 100% agree. I mean, I'm a big believer in human ingenuity solving the world's problems. And if I can give maybe one example, I was fortunate enough to see a demonstration. Ginny Rometty of IBM showed us an application for harnessing big data that she's using with the Watson computer. And the example that she gave was solving a healthcare issue. So if you imagine someone in a rural town in whatever country that you can envisage facing a serious medical issue, a Watson computer can sift through 40 million pieces of data, every clinical study that's ever been done, your personal records, every trial, every outcome, and find a customized solution for an individual. And the example they gave was someone facing cancer. The ordinary solution would be to deliver a chemotherapy solution for this individual. But what the computer was able to do was, by virtue of taking the individual's record and comparing that against outcomes of thousands and thousands of individual clinical trials and research papers, come up with a decision that the ordinary course treatment of a certain kind of chemotherapy was going to be inappropriate for that person because they had a heart condition. And a normal doctor in a rural environment would have never had access to all that information and would have prescribed the first form of chemo. And whereas this comes back and says, let me give you a customized solution by harnessing big data. Something like that is so incredibly powerful, and that's where I get hope, I think, as we go forward in solving some of these big issues that we all face.
Yeah, I think it's amazing the development achieved there. Last Friday, a very interesting exhibition was opened at the Science Museum here in London. So if you are visiting, I suggest you go and see it. It's called the Age of Information. It's wonderful, really. That's where the Queen tweeted for the first time of her life. I'm not sure if she pushed the right button or not, but anyway, people were prepared. It's wonderful, the rate at which we are moving forward. But also, always there is a caveat. And I know you want to end in a positive note. I'm not trying to end on a negative note. I'm just trying to raise a question which requires attention. And that is the future of jobs. One aspect of the new technology is that it needs less people, obviously. Intelligent machines replacing people, etc. We need just to think about the future of job. What will happen in 30 or 40 times? Do we need half the workforce we have now? I don't think not. Then what we're going to do? I think it's time to think. But unfortunately, we're all dealing with tabloids, headlines, and nobody interested in the long term. But
we need another hour for that.
Yeah.
We'll put the panel back together. And final thoughts?
Yeah, in terms of ending on a positive note, I think global inequality, despite what you might read, global inequality has shrunk. Within country, it has often expanded through the crisis, but actually in aggregate, global inequality is shrinking. And that is something to be positive about, unquestionably. In the very, very short term, I think the low oil price, we've not talked about oil today, but actually the low oil price will give us an economic boost and a kicker that will mitigate some of the other stuff that is going on, and we shouldn't underestimate the possible impact of that. And I think the final thing that I would add is very much coming back to this point on new technology, when I look at Africa and I look at the benefit that, for example, mobile technology has brought to new business creation in Africa, which wouldn't have been possible 10, 15 years before because the technology simply wasn't there. We would have had to put in old fixed lines and so forth. Although there is a risk that technology takes jobs, our population growth is slowing, and our ability to create new jobs as a result of that technology is growing. And I think eventually those two things will add out.
Ambassador, a very quick comment on innovation.
Very short, you know. It's 3 days ago I participated in the opening of the exhibition, which is called in the Science Museum here in London, Information Age. And the major conclusion is that we're moving from the resource-based economy to the high-tech economy. So this is probably will be the biggest benefit for all of us. And this is the positive stuff.
Minister,
well, I would think it's geoeconomy which is going to lead geopolitics. I think strategy and politics are going to follow the demands of the economy. And representing India, I would think that's where it's all happening. And I wish everyone comes and sees what's happening in India. Feel for yourself. You'll probably return lots more positive to your respective countries and get more investments to India, because that's where I think production will happen.
Well, thank you everyone for a lovely discussion, lively discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you to the panel. Ladies and gentlemen, the next breakout sessions will start in 15 minutes at 10:20. Please consult your programs or your event app for full details. Coffee and refreshments are available on each floor throughout the day. Our next breakouts are as follows. On level 29, we have Risk. On level 30, in breakout room 2, Collaborating to Fund Bioscience. On level 30, in breakout room 3, Europe, still at a crossroads. For full details of all of our sessions, please consult your summit program or the event app. Thank you.